Good morning. It is such a great opportunity for us to be here this morning, and it is so wonderful to see your faces and to be together as we join together and praise our wonderful God. If I asked you, what is this for, what would you say? To pound things, right? But a little kid might come up here and say, this is the greatest toy gun ever. I mean, this is great. Or I might say, hey, this is a great paperweight, so when the air conditioning comes on, it actually keeps my papers right where I need them. You see, we all come with different perspectives when it comes to even something like a hammer. And as we have been looking in this series, we all can come to the Bible with different perspectives. And in this series, what we're trying to do is to understand what is the intent, or what was the intent of the biblical authors as they were writing the Bible. What are we to understand from what they have written as they have written it? And so we have seen a number of things already as we look at this perspective, this frame of reference. We have said that it is the idea that it's both human and divine. In that it is a partnership between God and man. It is God's words, but man are the ones who have written it. Humans have written it. It is a unified story in that it is all of this different collection of Jewish literature, and yet it is all joined together in this idea that it tells one story. And that is the story of Jesus. And that led us into the next one, that the Bible is messianic. From beginning to end, it is telling about Jesus, the Anointed One. And what we said is, if I get to a place within the Bible and I can't see Jesus in there, it doesn't mean that He's not there. It means that I'm probably not asking the right questions. We also saw that it is meditation literature, meaning that the Bible is meant to be read and reread over a lifetime. That in many ways, much of the meaning of the Bible is not going to give itself up on the first reading. I have to reread it, and I have to compare stories to one another. But when I do that, then I gain from that meditation wisdom. And that wisdom is meant to shape who I am. It is meant to shape my character. It is really to tell me how to be human. And so those are the things that we have looked at thus far as we look at this perspective. But we want to continue on to understand, well, what else is in this perspective that we need to know? A phrase has been said before, words create worlds. I think that's very true. Words are how we communicate. It's how we interact with each other. It's how we share our lives. And my set of words might be different from your set of words. And it's probably certainly going to be different from a person who comes from a different country. And so it's important to realize the culture and the context in which we use words. Now, the same is true for the Bible. It was written in a culture and a time that is unlike ours. And we need to honor that ancient historical context so that we can better understand it. You know, there's some times where we might encounter things in the Bible that seem maybe even offensive to us, or at least strange. And rather than go, well, that just must be wrong, what we need to understand is that's probably my cultural norms butting up against the cultural norms of that ancient society. And probably the best thing that I can do is to set aside that lens, the way in which I'm looking at things, and seek to understand, well, what is the way, what is the culture, what are the words, and how are they used in that day and time? Because the Bible was written in that ancient culture and written with those ancient words. So as we think about this, let's just think for a few moments about the ancient Israelite context. And let's just start with words. If you think about it, words don't have meaning. People give them meaning by the way that they use them. Now, you can go to a dictionary and you can get an understanding, per se, of what a group of people mean with a particular word. Or you can use the context. How are people using that word in daily life? So let me just give you an example. How many of you know the meaning of the word meh? Oh, come on, young people, you better get your hands up. Raise them high. I'm expecting that pretty much just these 3 rows are the ones who understand the word meh. So, yeah, meh. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's try to understand it from context. So if I say, well, you know, a lot of those types of movies, they're sort of meh. I mean, you may be able to understand what I mean by that, but maybe not really. We have to go further. Well, if I ask somebody, how was your day? And they go, meh. Okay, maybe that gives you a little bit more understanding. If I say, well, what did you think of that performance? And a person says, meh, I'm not impressed so far. Now you begin to start to understand, okay, this is how this word is used. And for all of you who are older than, I don't know, 20, I had to ask my son the meaning of this word first so that I could use it. So it has the idea of expressing indifference or unexceptional or the idea of boredom. Well, you have your collection of words and the way in which they're used, and somebody who uses that word has their collection of words and the way in which they use, and they may not be the same, and so you have to figure out, okay, well, how are they using this word? Well, the same is true when we come to the Bible. We have to understand the context. For example, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, our Western culture and our mindset might think, oh, well, he's talking about the place where you go after you die. But if you look really at what Jesus is saying, at the context in which he says that phrase, he's talking about a reality that is arriving through him, something that is present now on earth. But you have to understand his meaning, and you have to study the culture and the language that Jesus was familiar with to be able to understand that. And that's really what is involved in translating. Because we're coming from either Hebrew or Aramaic or Greek into English. And many times it's not just translating the words, but it is understanding and considering the historical context, the culture, and even the literary styles. For example, let's take our word heart. Now, if you think about it, we have a lot of different definitions for the word heart. We would say, okay, it's that organ that pumps blood. But many times we can use it as it's the center of personality or emotion. Or you might say it's the central point of a given subject. Many times you might say, oh, well, I need to get into the heart of the matter, or let's go to the heart of the city. Well, what do we say? We're saying we've got to get to the central part of that. Well, in ancient Hebrew, the word heart had several different meanings. So, for example, if we go to Exodus chapter 4, where Moses there at the burning bush, and God is talking with him, and it says there, then the anger of Yahweh burned against Moses, and he said, is there not your brother Aaron the Levite? I know that he speaks fluently, and moreover, behold, he is coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. And we read that and we go, oh yeah, I understand that. His emotion is glad. It comes from his personality. He's glad in his heart. Or you can look over at 1 Samuel chapter 1, where Elkanah comes to Hannah and says, why are you sad of heart? The idea is there, we understand that. And so if we just looked at that, we might think, oh, well, the Hebrew word for heart means the same thing as the English word for heart. But let's go further. In Genesis chapter 17 and verse 17, we see Abraham. And this is just after Abraham has been told he's going to have a son. And it says, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said in his heart, will a child be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah, who is 90-year old, bear a child? Said in his heart. Now, most of us can sort of figure this out and say, oh, well, he's talking to himself. And there's actually some translations that will actually said, he said to himself. The idea is there, okay, he's thinking in his mind. It has the idea of speaking more of to all of the person. Well, let's go further and let's talk about what we talked about last week in Exodus chapter 31, where Bezalel and Oholiab are given this wisdom to be able to make the tabernacle. Well, it says there in verse 6, there God is saying, and behold, I myself have appointed with him Oholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and in the hearts of all who are skillful, I have put skill, that they may make all that I have commanded you. Now, if we are literally trying to say that, that means it is saying, in the heart of every wise-hearted one, I have given wisdom. So you begin to start looking at that and say, well, wait, wise-hearted one, or some translations might say it's skill. Well, how can you put skill in a heart? Well, there we would start to say, okay, well, he's sort of talking more about the idea of ability. And the English Standard Version actually says, I have given to all able men ability. And so we sort of begin to think, well, he's more talking about the brain. But here's the thing. In ancient Hebrew, there is no word for brain. It just didn't exist. They saw the heart as the central place for both emotions and thought. Everything was about the heart. And so if we go even further in 1 Kings, where Solomon has asked for wisdom from God. 1 Kings 4:29 says, now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind, like the sand that is on the seashore. Breadth of mind. Now keep in mind, it's funny how we use words, that there is no word for mind in the Hebrew. So King James Version translates that largeness of heart, or the idea is width or wideness of heart. If you go around saying that to somebody today, they're going to look at you funny. Oh, I have wideness of heart. What does that mean? Well, if you look at the context, we understand that. And so we have the New Living Translation that says, God gave Solomon very great wisdom and understanding and knowledge as vast as the sands of the seashore. We understand that based upon our words and all that. But if we go back to the very meaning of the word heart from the Hebrew, what we see is it's much greater, it's much deeper than, oh, well, it's just a place of emotion. So, well, what does that mean for us? Well, if we go then to Luke chapter 10 and verse 27, where Jesus says to the man, what does the law say? And the man answers, you shall love the Lord with all the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. Heart has a deeper meaning there than just my emotions. And even if you look at where this is referenced in the Old Testament in Deuteronomy chapter 6, it doesn't say the word mind. It says you shall love the Lord with your heart, with your soul, and with all your might. And so the translators are trying to get us to understand the meaning concept of it is everything about you is what you are to use to love God. Now, as we think about that, let's go a step further. And what I want us to sort of do is go from the micro out to the macro. So if words, and especially in another language, if they embody a culture's way of thinking and seeing the world, then what we should expect is that the ideas and the way that they think are influenced by the cultural norms and certain assumptions of that culture. And so when we think about cosmology, and that's just, to me, that's a big word that really just means an account of how reality is ordered and how it came to be that way. So we're talking about, okay, well, we might say, oh, what are the origins of the universe and the reality in which we know? So let me ask it this way. When you come to Genesis 1:1, and it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, what do you automatically think of? Probably most of us think of the globe that is Earth, the sphere that is Earth. And we might think of all of these some 200 billion stars that are in our galaxy. And if we expand it out beyond that, we could go to the some 1 to 2 trillion estimated galaxies that are in the known universe at this time. That's probably how we think when we read Genesis 1:1. And we need to admit that we have a much greater sense of time and space than the ancient writers. That view shapes our thinking in probably a much different way than the writers as they wrote the Bible. For example, if we literally translated Genesis 1:1, it would say, in the beginning, God created the skies and the land. You see, the biblical authors are writing from an observational point of view. They're standing on the ground and they are looking up. And so this is more of their cosmology. This is more of how they understand how things are. They're looking on the ground up, and it seems like they're part of a dome. Sort of makes sense. You go outside, you look around, you're like, oh yeah, it's sort of somewhat of a circle around me. But it's the idea that really seems like it's a snow globe. Water's above, water's below. God separated the waters, land came up from the waters. And so that biblical language then makes certain assumptions. For example, the assumption is that they live on a flat disk, that there are 4 corners of the land, that water is under the land, and that land is on pillars. So when we come to Job 9 and verse 6, where Job is talking about God, and he says, who shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. if we have their perspective rather than our perspective, it tends to make a little more sense. Oh, okay, that's the way they understood the world around them. Well, what we're saying is not, well, we need to adopt a flat earth theory, but we need to understand their perspective to better understand the way in which they are writing. And one of the takeaways, I think, is said very well by a scholar, Robin Perry. It said, remember in the biblical text, the symbolic meaning of the image of heaven above had always been the most important thing about such language. Height or depth spoke of relative importance and rank. And for the biblical authors, the idea of heaven being above the rest of creation meant that heaven was the most important dimension of the created world. Because from that high and exalted place, God ruled over all things. And so it's a matter of understanding that perspective. Well, let's look at another part of that perspective, and that would be the material versus spiritual reality. In our scientific world, we look at nature and we say that it is probably a group of processes of cause and effect. We would say it's a whole bunch of molecules just banging around against each other. And certain things happen as a result of that. Well, that has led to a view where people would say, well, the material world is the only reality. That's what is real. Now, maybe in our Western culture, especially from a spiritual standpoint, a religious standpoint, we might begin to say, well, wait a minute, no, there is the spiritual realm, but in a lot of ways, people tend to think that the spiritual realm is in no way connected to the material realm, or that the material realm is opposite of spiritual reality. And so people have proposed what they would say is God is a clockmaker. You know, God winds up the clock and then he lets it go. And then if he wants to, he can intervene into that realm, but even the word intervene means he enters into it. You say, okay, well, I'm tracking with you a little bit, but think about this. The biblical authors never saw the spiritual and material as opposites, but as overlapping spaces. They saw the divine, which flows out from God, as that which is most real. So spiritual didn't always mean non-material, but it was the idea that the spiritual was that which was the ultimate. And it was expressed in the material world. That was the way in which the spiritual was expressed. So let me give you an example. Everybody take a breath in. Take a breath and let it out. Okay, we're breathing, right? Scientists would say, oh, okay, you have drawn air into your lungs where you are pulling oxygen into your body, and as you exhale, you let carbon dioxide go out. We understand that from grade school. That seems to be that process type of way in which we approach the world. But the biblical authors see breathing as God's Spirit in us. That the physical is participating with the divine. Let me show you an example of this from the Psalms. Psalm 104, and it's talking here about all of God's creation, all of the animals. It says, they all wait, meaning the animals, for you to give them their food in due season. You give to them, they gather it up. You open your hand, they are satisfied with good. You hide your face, they are dismayed. You take away their spirit, they expire and return to their dust. You send forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground. Now, the materialistic approach is saying, well, yeah, he's just talking about nature. Nature provides for itself. But the biblical writers don't see it that way. They see it as God, he has a hand, not just in creation and letting it go, but he has a hand in creation on a daily basis that he is giving to them. And as it says there, if he were to take away his spirit, they die. They return back to the dust. But if he gives the spirit, they come alive. That gives us some insight into how they viewed connecting with the spiritual. For example, we've talked about this before. If we go back to Eden and the garden that was there, they saw the garden in Eden as overlapping spaces of both heaven and earth. And that living outside of Eden, we might say, was sub-spiritual. It was less spiritual. Still meaning that God's Spirit was controlling everything, but it was less because it was further away from the ideal. So if you think about just what we've already said from biblical cosmology, their perspective is the higher you go, the closer you get to the divine. Or if you think of it spatially from inward to outward, the closer inward you go, the closer you get to that which is divine. Say, okay, well, what does that mean for us? Well, I never understood quite what all of this meant, but if you read through the Old Testament, especially in the times of the kings and everything, they talk about all of these high places. The high places were on mountains. So the idea was the closer, if I can get up on a mountain, I'm closer to the divine. Or you'd read phrases like in the city, inside the tent, in the shadow of your wing. The idea is the closer in you get, that's closer to the divine. And the opposite would be true. If I'm going outside the city, that's common. And so what do you see? Well, you see exile. Well, what do? You go away from the city. So think about the things that we see. Moses, he goes up on a mountain, Mount Sinai, to get the pattern for the tabernacle. The temple is placed on Mount Zion. The New Jerusalem is on high as you look at the book of Revelation, and it is coming down to earth to merge with earth. I like as one person put it, they said, the biblical story does not end with the idea of disembodied, non-material world, but a material world that has been transformed by the merging with the spiritual. And say, okay, what does that mean for me? I don't know about you, but that helps me understand when I get to Luke 24 and it says, he arose and he appeared to the disciples and he says, hey, do you have any fish? That, to me, a lot of times just doesn't compute. Wait a minute. How can Jesus have a body that he's eating fish, but he can pass through walls? Well, that image of the spiritual and the physical merging helps me make sense of that. That it's not just the physical, it's not just the material, but it's something brand new. It's this infusement of the spiritual and the physical. Let me give you one more, and we'll wrap things up. In ancient Israel context, there's the idea of the individual versus the collective. Now, in our Western culture, only an individual can be held responsible for their choices. You do something bad, you pay the consequences for that. You do something good, you get the reward for that. That's how we as a society, that's how we function. But for the biblical authors, an individual's choices implicate and affect the larger group, family, and nation to which they belong, such that the primary unit of responsibility lies with the group rather than the individual. So, in that mindset, what we would see is that an entire group can be held accountable for an individual's choices. An example of this would be in Joshua chapter 7 and 8. Achan's sin, where he took those things. He's the one who did it. And yet what we see is the punishment is for his entire family. All of his possessions are gone. That's the punishment. And we look at it, we go, well, that doesn't seem fair. Did they really participate in all of that? Or in 1 Samuel chapter 20, or 2 Samuel chapter 24, where David counts the people. God didn't tell him to take a census of the people. And Joab is one who's saying, hey, look, you probably don't need to do that. David says, nope, go ahead, count the people. And then David realizes, oh, I made a mistake. I messed up. I sinned. And so God comes to him and says, you got 3 choices. Pick what you want. And David finally gets to the point where he wises up. He's like, I am not going to pick God. You be the one to decide. And he sends them this plague that comes and starts killing all of these other Israelites. And when we read that, we go, well, that doesn't seem fair. How does that work? I mean, David's the one who sinned, and yet other people are being punished. Well, that's the context in which biblical authors lived. That's how they saw the world. And in many ways, this story is wrestling with the relationship of the one versus the many, and that concept of justice. How is God going to deal with human failure and evil, even if it means holding the many accountable for the one? So what we also see then is an individual can take responsibility for a group's behavior. If you were to go over to Daniel chapter 9, Daniel prays this prayer, and in this prayer, he takes responsibility for all the prior generations of Israel. He takes responsibility for all their sin. Now, let me ask you today, do you want to take responsibility for your fathers, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your great-great-great-grandfathers, all of their sins? No, none of us would. We'd say, no, that's their fault. They messed up. I shouldn't have to be responsible for that. And yet, that's exactly what David does. He aligns himself with that and says, I'm part of that. I take responsibility for their sins. Which in many ways leads to this idea of what's been called an honor-shame culture, where the idea is honor is either gained or lost. And the value that you have is not based upon who you are, so to speak. It's not based upon your self-esteem, which that's how we live today, right? It is a matter of who you are and what you value yourself. That's foreign to the biblical authors. They were very much more of an honor shame that says you are defined by your group. And what you do impacts your group. What we see is Jesus comes along and he goes against that. He says, it's not a matter whether you are Jew or Greek, whether you are male, whether you are free or whether you are a slave, or whether you are a male or female. He says that what matters is how you come in contact with God and have a relationship with God. And yet, what we see in Isaiah 53 and verses 4 through 6, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. We, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Do you realize that Isaiah 53 is very much entrenched in that collective idea of the suffering servant dying for the sins of his people so that his vindication from death becomes their vindication? He's the one who takes our shame. He doesn't deserve it. But yet he takes it upon himself so that we then can share in his glory. As we look at all of these things, what I'm not saying is that we are to adopt all of these assumptions that were there within the Israelite culture. And I'm not saying that all of them are right by God's standards. But God works within those cultures and even challenges some of those assumptions to bring about his will. But it helps for us to understand how they are thinking and to see how God works within those assumptions, because it is a story that all leads to Jesus. Words create worlds. Some of the greatest words that have ever been spoken are, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing." Those words created a world of forgiveness and grace in which we can come and we can be a part. We can share in the divine in a relationship with our Father because of that world. This morning I ask you, are you a part of this world? Your Savior came. He took on your sin so that you might share in his glory. If you don't have that hope this morning, why not turn to him? Why not come and enjoy that world that he has created? Maybe you need help. Maybe you're like all of us and we are broken people and we just need each other. We can pray together. In whatever way we can help you, won't you come as together we stand and sing?